If things were to start to crumble for Christie, who does the establishment turn to as its candidate next? Well, to discuss all of these questions, we are joined by Congressman Steve Cohen. He's a Democrat from Tennessee, with NBC political producer Kasie Hunt, who is reporting from the RNC winter meetings this week. Elahe Izade, she's politics writer at the National Journal. And John Stanton, Washington bureau chief for BuzzFeed.com. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And Kasie, I'll start with you, since you probably spent the most time this week with Republicans, anybody at this table.
Spent a lot of time together.
So your observations on just the conversations you had this week in Washington with Republicans about Chris Christie, what were you picking up on?
Chris Christie is still somebody who Republicans view as a potential candidate in 2016. I would say that he's gone from sort of being the one who sits at the top of everyone's list when you ask, so hey, who do you think is going to be best in the running for 2016? It used to be that their first answer would be, well, look at all of our governors, Chris Christie in New Jersey, for example. Now it's, well, look at all our governors, Scott Walker in Wisconsin, for example. So I think there are still a lot of willingness to give Chris Christie the benefit of the doubt, but it's still coming with the caveat that this is the case only if there's not another shoe to drop. And the reality is, as you were walking through with all from New Jersey earlier on this show, there's going to be a long time and a lot of paper and a lot of testimony before we figure out whether or not there's another shoe. And that's going to be a lot of distraction for Chris Christie in all of his roles, whether it's serving as governor of New Jersey or trying to raise money for the RGA.
So do we have a sense, just to put this in perspective, we have a couple poll numbers we can show. This is a national poll. This is the head-to-head from Quinnipiac. Christie versus Hillary for 2016. You can see a month after, back in December, I should say, it was 42-41 Christie. Looks like the Republicans' best bet, all of that. Now, Tuesday, as all these storms are sort of gathering, Hillary Clinton now up 8 points in that head-to-head. This, again, supposedly was the Republicans' best bet. There's also the scramble among Republicans. This is the Quinnipiac poll this week. Again, back in December, Christie, you know, these are all small numbers here, but Christie was out in front at 17. You know, he's lost about a third of that, down to 12% now. There's just a jumble of names right there. But Elahe, I guess I'm thinking of that Florida trip last weekend, and the Christie people heading into last weekend were talking about, he's come out, he's given his nearly 2-hour, marathon press conference. This is about moving beyond this, and he's going to have his inauguration next week, and we're going to move past it. He goes down to Florida, and Rick Scott, who is an embattled gubernatorial candidate, I mean, somebody that the chairman of the RGA has to care about, doesn't want to be seen with him. There's no public appearances with Rick Scott. There's really no public appearances with Christie at all. How, under this cloud, can he function in that role? How can he go into Massachusetts, a blue state, where they have a shot of winning the governor's race? How can he go in there and campaign? How can he go down to Texas? How can he go to some of these states where Republicans really have a shot? And are these candidates going to want to be associated with him until and unless this is cleared up?
Well, one of the ways he can have the biggest impact is maybe not being publicly campaigning with these candidates and being shown with them, because, as was said, there could be another shoe that drops, and you don't want a photo op of you next to someone, and then a week later you find out it was way worse than everyone thought it was going to be. But what he can do is privately raise money behind closed doors, although that's still a little problematic, because if donors are concerned, having those same concerns about another shoe dropping, well, they want to put a lot of money on the table and have that kind of tie. But he can still raise money, and that's a big role that he has to play for the RGA.
And that has been a big part of Chris Christie's political base, really. I call it sort of the Wall Street Journal crowd. I mean, it's the big bucks, sort of New York-centric people. They were the ones who were really trying to recruit him into the race at the last minute for 2012. Do we have a sense how are they sticking with him? Are they starting to have doubts?
I think initially there was definitely some doubts. From what I've heard about the fundraisers he was doing in Florida, though, for instance, at the last minute, a number of these guys sort of came forward and said, hey, I'm not on the list. Can I get on the list? I'd like to come down. Now, as one person said, it may be a bit of rubbernecking at the dead guy kind of a deal, but it also could be that there are Republicans that are looking at him and saying he's getting beat up really bad. The conservatives that have been the bane in his side for years are suddenly no longer at least attacking him constantly, and some of them are now coming to his defense, and some of the money people are saying, we're going to put our money on him and at least give him some cash at this point. So it doesn't seem like it's hurting that side of his operation right now.
Well, and Congressman, how do you look at this as a Democrat? Because, I mean, did you accept sort of, as of a month ago, as of before this all sort of exploded, in your mind, was Chris Christie the Republican you didn't want your party to have to face in 2016?
I think so, because he does go to the middle better, and he claims to have Democratic support. and he has an understanding. You know, he got out with Obama. He wasn't afraid to touch him. And, yeah, I think he would have been a more difficult candidate than a right-wing extremist.
And what's your assessment of where it is right now? Obviously, he's embattled. Are you looking at this, though, and saying, like, yeah, I have a feeling he'll come through this and he'll be fine 6 months from now? Or what is your sense, and what is the sense of Democrats in Washington about how serious this is?
I think most people think he's toast. You know, I don't think people want their president and their politicians to care about them. It's about the people and the constituency and not about the candidate or the office holder. And I think what's come out of this is that Chris Christie cares about himself a lot. He is the center of everything, and he was when he was U.S. attorney and appointed all those monitors, which is where we really saw how good he was at raising money and catering and to people who have money and the ability to raise money. He's a political animal. And I don't think the American public is going to want somebody as president. You know, and think about foreign policy, the way he talks about people. If he's talked that way about the North Korean president and said, you know, he's stupid or something else, bomb falls. You know, he can't have somebody with that type of demeanor dealing in foreign policy with some people who are pretty crazy. Well, you know, you have to have one sane person in the room.
Well, how much of this is like, so much of this of these scandals has, to me at least, has like sort of this only in Jersey feel to it, right? It brings up, because I've always said, like, you know, Christie sort of traded on nationally a positive image of New Jersey, the image that New Jersey is home to a lot of, you know, the people who are rough around the edges, but they give you, you know, straight talk, and they're not going to, you know, BS you. And Chris Christie would go to these Republican events, you know, in Iowa or wherever it was, and he would tell them, you know, I'm going to talk to you guys Jersey style, and they'd love it because it would be this like blunt. And it seemed like the other image of New Jersey is reinforced by all this. Kasie, like when you're talking to Republicans this week, were you picking up on any of that at all? Like, oh, this is New Jersey, we don't want to touch this. This is...
For sure. Well, you know, I mean, it wasn't just appearances in Iowa and New Hampshire. It was his whole convention address. If you remember when he gave the evening speech at the Republican National Convention, they had all these graphics, New Jersey. I mean, that was the whole focus, and it's a big part of, you know, what he's selling. But there is, and there was discussed a lot of concern about how, you know, his personality is a wild card. And this is something any candidate that is making the jump from a small, even a big state like New Jersey. I mean, Rick Perry ran headlong into this when he ran from Texas. He thought, oh, I've been elected governor of Texas easily. This is not going to be a problem. Stepping onto this bigger stage is an entirely different enterprise. And if he gets into a situation where, I mean, we've seen him confront, you know, members of teachers' unions, for example. If something like that were to happen in an early state like Iowa or New Hampshire, and it turned out that the backstory was something that turned out to be problematic, I mean, when there were several people I spoke to at the winter meeting this week that raised questions about whether or not his personality, while on the one hand could be his biggest selling point, could be a huge weakness in a presidential campaign.
I've always been a little skeptical, frankly, of the notion that he could win a primary, because he's not going to win in South Carolina. He's not going to win in most of the southern states, because
any of the southern states. He can't win in Louisiana.
Right, because he is Tony Soprano to those people, and whether he likes it or not, that's the truth. And they're not going to vote for him. He's very much an outsider, an alien to them.
Senator Lindsey Graham raised that issue with me. He said, you know, I'm not quite sure that he can win in the South. It's like, while we like our politicians to be people who speak truth to power, they also, you know, they want somebody who's polite. And does Christie come across that way to Christian evangelical voters that he would have to win over in some of those states? That's
true. We'll pick this up on the other side, and we'll start to look at, you know, if not Christie, who question, and who on the Republican side nationally has been sort of, we've had a few quotes, some interesting quotes from Republicans maybe trying to capitalize on this moment for Chris Christie. We'll look at that, and we'll raise that question right after this.
I don't know who emailed who and who works for whom, and I have been in traffic before that. I know how angry I am when I'm in traffic, and I'm always wondering, who did this to me?
Do you think it said something about his leadership style they didn't know?
Yeah, other people have to judge that.
You know, there are just certain politicians who, you know, when they're enjoying a moment, they're just loving a moment. There is this history now between Chris Christie and Rand Paul, and Chris Christie has been really, you know, hard on Rand Paul, and now Rand Paul gets a chance to kind of return the favor, and he gets to play this sort of, you know, play up the populist outrage around this. But I play that moment not just because there's the Rand Paul-Chris Christie rivalry, but in the context of what happened at the RNC meeting with the NSA resolution that was passed at the RNC meeting. And I'm wondering if, you know, again, we always talk about the Republicans. They invariably they nominate Bob Dole, they nominate George W. Bush, McCain, Romney. They never seem to go to the true believer Rand Paul type candidate. I know it's early, but I'm starting to look at this, and I'm like, boy, if this leads to Christie being taken off the board, and you look at the Republican Party's shift a little bit more towards libertarianism, is Rand Paul one of those who's positioned to pick up the pieces?
Well, what's really interesting, especially about the poll numbers that you showed, despite Christie losing ground versus Hillary Clinton, he still performs better than other potential 2016 candidates against Hillary Clinton. He performs better than Rand Paul. So the question is, can he survive a primary to get to a general? And there is a concern among moderates that with this whole scandal that we will end up with a Rand Paul as the Republican candidate.
I mean,
and he won't be able to beat
Can't win the general election. Yeah. So, but that's the question. Like, besides Chris Christie, who else is out there who can play that sort of moderate role? Who could be the electable George W. Bush in 2000? You know, that
Jeb Bush.
Yeah. His brother.
Or Rubio potentially, but Rubio's problem is that he clearly gets skittish, right? On immigration, he came out very hard, and instead of continuing to force the issue, he backed away, and they pounced on him, the conservatives, and that, I think, hurts him. But, you know, if you look at politics right now, Terry McAuliffe is a governor. If Terry McAuliffe can be governor, then Rick Santorum can definitely be president.
Although, but the story of how Terry McAuliffe became governor is basically the Republicans nominated like a Santorum-like candidate, and people were like, well, we don't really like Terry McAuliffe, but we don't want to. That's why I think Virginia is such a valuable bellwether for 2016, because it sort of showed there is a too far that Republicans can go. And if without Christie, so you say Jeb Bush, you know, the thing I remember about Jeb Bush is that jumps out of my mind is he has not actually run. He's not actually been on a ballot since 2002. It'd be a 14-year gap if Jeb Bush runs in 2016.
And some of the things Hillary Clinton has faced as she has stepped sort of into the Twitter universe, as you will, the speed with which you have to respond. I mean, Jeb even ran into it a little bit. He gave a speech to conservatives, and while the reaction in the room was great, reaction among conservatives, the blogs, I mean, the entire landscape of how campaigns are conducted has changed. And he also, while he's seen his brother and obviously his father campaign for the presidency, the world is so different, and he himself has only won statewide.
But he has been slow. Like, if you look at his book, for instance, on immigration, he knew full well that the landscape had changed, and instead of going in and making some changes to the book, they sort of came out with it, and he now all of a sudden ended up further to the right than most of his party was. And
it seems out of practice. Yeah. And then his mother every other day is out there saying he shouldn't run. I don't know if that, I don't know if that helps at all. But Congressman, I mean, so you're saying you saw Christie before all this as, you know, the biggest threat to your party in 2016. Who do you see as the second biggest?
I wouldn't use biggest as but go ahead.
Sorry,
you get away with it. Although I did think about the Hindenburg in New Jersey years ago, and that was a great deflation as well.
Well, he was the gravest threat. Well, we'll go with that. I'm going to try to avoid getting in trouble here. But who's the second gravest threat?
I think the governor of Ohio, who did allow for Medicaid to be expanded in his state and said it was the right thing to do. And I think there's certain governors in my state, they haven't done it. We have over $1 billion we've given away, and people, hundreds of thousands of people not getting health care. I think it's a mark of a person who is not being fiscally or morally responsible, not taking the Medicaid money. And Kasie was one of the first people to do it. And I think Ohio's an important state. And I think he's somebody who could come forth and be a responsible candidate for them. I think Portman's a possibility. I think there's several people. I don't think people want to see a Bush-Clinton election. I'm for Hillary Clinton, and I want her to be president again. But I don't think people want to see Bush Clinton in 2016. We had Bush Clinton in 1992, and I think the Republicans will want to see something different. And they'll go, this is different, and we want to move forward with a new generation. I think they're better off with a new face.
Well, it's just when you start looking at the names, it becomes, you know, who is that, you know, new face? Is it, you know, Rand Paul? Is it Ted Cruz? You know, is it Marco Rubio? We've talked about his problems. Here's a quote, though, from Caton Dawson. He's the former Republican chairman in South Carolina, ran for the National Party chairmanship a few years ago, talking about this Christie scandal and Christie's future. He says this all has the potential to affect the RG governor's races if it grows any more legs, like it has with the Hoboken mayor. Mark Sanford is a guy who resigned and didn't want any of his scandal embroiled around the RGA. Now nobody's called for that from Christie, but if we've got 2-3 more scandals, that's the concern I've got. And you raised that earlier, Kasie. It seems like this is the first test of Chris Christie's 2016 viability is, can he make it through 2014 with this job? Because if he loses this job, if he's forced to resign from this job, that's just such a public rebuke. I can't imagine him turning around and running for president.
Well, in fairness, he did not disappear while on the job for days with a mistress on the Appalachian Trail. Yeah. So, you know, we still have yet to see exactly how this is going to shake out for Chris Christie. But that really is, I mean, Look, the invisible primary, as early as it is, it's already starting. Obviously, people are already making connections to donors. Rand Paul is making visit after visit to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. You know, if Christie is serious about this, and obviously it's pretty obvious that he is, you know, he does need to be focusing on that. Now, his RGA job will allow him to do a lot of that groundwork. He's going to be networking in states with donors, but the issue is that his focus is going to be so splintered while he deals with all of these subpoenas, all of this back home. And if it affects the way that he can govern in New Jersey, that's going to affect the record that he has to run on if he decides to run for president.
And there was the whole issue, too, and we reported on this on this show, where, and this might have affected, there's this whole debate that goes back and forth between unnamed Christie people and unnamed Romney people about why wasn't Christie actually on the ticket in 2012. And the Christie people like to have the story out there that it's because of these SEC rules, Securities and Exchange Commission rules, that would have made it impossible. He would have had to resign as governor to be raising like Wall Street money, you know, big money for the campaign. And this supposedly would also get in his way in 2016. So there was sort of this expectation in New Jersey that, you know, a re-elected Chris Christie was going to resign as governor within, you know, 2 years or so to go off and run nationally. Now, if the national campaign is taken off the table at all, this is a guy with, you know, 4 more years, you know, left in New Jersey.
Well, the party has had this problem. They're very, like, schizophrenic almost. Like, remember in 2012, every week was a different person was the front runner. And then this last year you had Ted Cruz, who came out and was, you know, the savior of the party. And now no one remembers who Ted Cruz is practically. And, you know, these guys like Christie, who are making these big plans about 4 years from now, should keep that in mind, that, you know, you're going to be the flavor of the month at least 1 week over the next couple of years, but that may be it. And then you're going to have to...
It could be somebody that you totally don't think of. You know, and Tennessee has a history of senators who have ambitions as president. You go back to Estes Kefauver, Albert Gore Sr. even, Jr. obviously, Lamar Alexander. Bob Corker, bright, does a good job in the Senate.
There's Bob Corker 16 trial by Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen. We have made some news. This is about 3 minutes, a couple minutes left to finish this discussion, and at the end of it, we'll have an exciting announcement about what's coming at the end of the show. Stick around. We'll be right back.
He uses, allegedly, hardball, sometimes bullying tactics against people who cross him. Have you never experienced that side of him?
No, Chris and I get along very well. We're close friends, and I watched a president known as LBJ push through civil rights legislation because he was a strong leader, knew how to make things happen. We're watching right now a Washington that can't get the job done. Chris does, and I think that's one of the reasons he's as popular as he is.
That is Mitt Romney being asked yesterday about Chris Christie's troubles. He was also, apparently, Romney was on the Jimmy Fallon show, and there's this new Mitt documentary this week. It's a huge Mitt Romney weekend in America. I hope you're all prepared. But that quote there is so interesting to me because he's being asked by Savannah Guthrie about bullying from Christie, and his response is, well, you know, LBJ was a bully and he got civil rights through. But obviously the danger of the story is that, especially the allegations from the mayor of Hoboken, we're not talking about using bullying for some grand purpose. The idea here would be using Sandy money as leverage to get a development project through that one of your best friends, you know, his law firm represents. I don't think people would equate that on the same level of civil rights. But I guess that's one thing I'm wondering about, Kasie, though, is like that image of bullying. It sort of has cut both ways, I think, and a lot of Republicans have received it one way the last 2 years because he's a strong leader, sort of like what you're hearing from Mitt Romney. But I wonder if Republicans themselves are starting to rethink that.
I think there's definitely a sense that while on the one hand, Christie's personality has been something that's appealed to even some elements of the Tea Party. I mean, he has problems with conservatives, but that sort of anger among the Tea Party, that wanting to take it to Washington and wanting somebody who's going to stand up there and sort of speak the people's voice. I mean, Christie has spoken to some people in those groups in the past. I think at this point, it's pretty clear that it's starting to turn on itself and that it's something that could easily be a weakness. And as we were sort of discussing before, you know, it could lead him to make mistakes if in a very high-profile setting or in a presidential race.
It all depends how those mistakes get interpreted when they happen, right? Because it can be, oh, this is just the tough-talking Jersey guy, or it could be Christie the bully again, and that's sort of one of the risks here. Local
politics is always a bit unseemly, and as you well know, New Jersey local politics is very unseemly in a lot of cases. And you know, this is, I think, always been his biggest risk, is that if there are other incidents, and even not like scandals like this, but just sort of the day-to-day operation of politics in New Jersey. If other Americans start looking at that, that could become a very big problem for him because he fills that entire space. It can't just be him and everybody else doing it. It will become him being the guy that's behind some kind of crazy project.
You know, and Mitt Romney compares him to President Johnson, and there's no comparison, really. President Johnson did become president under the most awful circumstances imaginable, and then when he was reelected in '64, he was such a break with Goldwater, and he had the Kennedy impetus. But Lyndon Johnson didn't win an election with all the media you have today and the social media. And Lyndon Johnson couldn't win with Steve Kornacki on him and breaking a story about what he did on this TV station or something in Austin, because you'd have it, and the media would have it now. There's so many stations. It used to be, you know, Nancy Dickerson, and he knew how to deal with Nancy Dickerson.
And Johnson was a legislator at heart, too.
Right.
We can't forget that if you're going to compare leadership with Chris Christie. But, I mean, you know, there's this axiom in politics, too, never do anything crooked that the average person can understand. And that's where, you know, we don't know yet whether or not Chris Christie actually did anything crooked. But he was clearly, or the people who worked for him were involved in something that every voter understands. I mean, you know, Rand Paul cracked a joke about it, but everyone in America knows what it's like to be stuck in traffic. And, you know, that, regardless of how this shakes out, that could be the problem with this for Chris Christie.
Well, I'm tempted to dwell on this idea that I could have taken down Lyndon Johnson, and I love that. Let's come with a list of the other presidents, because, you know, Harrison, I would have had him out in 15 days, I bet. No, I don't
take this coat away from him. Weeks instead of months.
But it is just amazing that what we're talking about. I mean, look, I have the background in New Jersey, so this has been an interesting story for me to cover. But I mean, I've never seen an example of, you know, a lane closure on a bridge in one state becoming a scandal that's almost covered at presidential level. It's because Christie is such... I was trying to think what accounts for it, because, you know, at the start of the show, we went through Jim McGreevey, a former governor of New Jersey. All these investigations when he was governor, they were big news in New Jersey. Nobody cared outside of New Jersey. Everybody cares about this, and it's because Christie is just such a national figure, and it's such an understandable and mysterious scandal.
Definitely, and it does play to this image or idea that people have of him, that he is a straight talker, but maybe perhaps he could be a little bit of a bully. And one of the things that people, especially moderates and independents, like about him is that he's not afraid to go against the Tea Party and the conservative base. You know, he rebuked the House of Representatives when they wouldn't approve Sandy Aid, and he put Republicans in Washington on blast. But the traffic element is really fascinating to me, because everyone understands traffic, and nothing, it's the most mundane thing that could become a scandal.
Exactly.
Really.
But then, of course, now that he's embroiled in all of this, he reversed to sort of classic, I think, the classic sort of conservative playbook, where their first statement last weekend was, you know, attacking the liberal media for its vendetta. So I wonder if there's sort of a shift in their strategy there. Anyway, coming up, if it felt like your life was missing something last weekend, you weren't alone. We felt it too. Our attempt to fill that void and return to normalcy. It's next. All right, I want to find out what my guests know now that they didn't know when the week began, and we will start with the new champion, Elahe Izade.
Oh, well, this week we found out that in Florida, 10,000 people missed out on unemployment checks for months because of a computer glitch. So now that long-term unemployment insurance has ended around the country, some places they weren't getting those checks for a while anyway because of computer problems.
Ugh. Stanton.
We have a story this week. It's a great story about the murder of Killer P, a rapper in Greece who was killed by the Golden Dawn. They are a neo-Nazi fascist group that is also a political party, and it's a fascinating look at sort of the divisions within Greece and the problems they're having with fascism right now.
All right, and Congressman?
I think the polar vortex coming back and telling Republicans and other deniers that there is climate change. Coca-Cola now knows there's climate change, and that we need to deal with this issue, as well as evolution and some of the other things they deny.
And Kasie.
I learned this week that Reince Priebus is throwing his weight around a little bit at the Republican National Committee, so it'll be interesting to watch how the next year plays out with him at the helm.
All right, and I learned this week, Carmelo Anthony's last night, 62 points for the Knicks, and they benched him with time left. He could have had 70. Keep him in there. Keep it going. Let's see some real big numbers there. Anyway, I want to thank Elahe Izade, John Stanton, Congressman Steve Cohen, and Kasie Hunt. Thank you for getting up this morning, and thank you for joining us today for